Hi, I'm Matt Thompson. Welcome to my HO Scale Oregon Coast Railroad. I'm going to talk about transitioning my railroad's operations from timetable and train order track authority to a switching layout. I'll cover why I made the change, what I did to make it happen, and how the layout is operated now. This clinic is a slightly revised version of the clinic I presented to the OPSIG meeting in September of 2022. The OCRR has a single track main line with no passenger service. The traffic is mostly lumber and agricultural products with some general freight. The railroad is proto-freelance or maybe just freelance. I use Oregon place names and industry names, but there are no signature scenes of Oregon and no models of actual Oregon structures. When I built my OCRR, my goal was to build a suitable layout for timetable and train order operations, and that's what I did. The Spokane, Portland, and Seattle A line ran from Portland to Astoria. My fictional OCRR story is that the OCRR was fully owned by the SP&S, and the OCRR ran the A line. I also added to the story by imagining a line going south from Astoria to Coos Bay, where it would interchange with the Southern Pacific. In the real world, no railroad ever ran down the coast. The terrain is too rugged and the area is too thinly populated. I've never modeled the leg from Tillamook to Coos Bay. The railroad story is a good scenario, and we've had fun operating the layout. The best thing about timetable and train order operations is the challenge of doing it attracts some of the best and most knowledgeable model railroaders to my layout, and they also invite me to their layouts. I really enjoy that part of our hobby. But timetable and train order can also be more work than some people want to put into the hobby, and even those of us who know better aren't always up to the challenge. Getting a good dispatcher is a key to a good session. Here you can see Steve King has written 2 books on applying prototype railroad operations to model railroads. But not too many folks have Steve's skill, and even those that do sometimes just want to take a break and run trains. That's a limiting factor in holding operating sessions. And sometimes, when no one else is around, I just like to run a train to entertain myself. The problem is staging on a timetable train order layout can be complicated, and running a train out of sequence can mess it up. Fixing what I unraveled can take longer than running the train did, so that's always been a disincentive. I never minded creating timetable and train order documents. The thought process has helped me understand the layout and prototype operations better, but keeping them up to date has always been a bit of a problem. The bug for a switching layout got started with Chuck Hitchcock's Argentine Industrial District. I've read that article many times and talked about it with Chuck. I only got to layout once, but was really impressed. I've also been to his new Santa Fe layout, and it's just the kind of ops I most enjoy. Paul Dolkus's Harbor District layout is all industrial switching. Paul is a good friend who lives nearby. I've done all of the jobs on the layout. I really like the work, and I really like the relaxed pace. I had only been thinking about changing the railroad theme to a switching layout for quite a while. When the pandemic hit and I realized I had time to make the change, I did it. I like having a throttle in hand, running an engine and moving cars without a lot of other thought. That was a big motivator. I also liked the model, and since my layout was basically complete, the change would give me new things to do. The dispatcher role on a switching layout is not nearly as difficult or as key to a good session as it is on a timetable and train order railroad, and I'll explain that a little later. On top of the hill in this picture with a log loading track and a small lumber mill, running them never worked right. The site was too high and operators had to reach in too far. The scene needed to go, and now it's gone. My layout already had 3 yards and several large industries, so the change wasn't much work. I also had Northern Pacific and SP&S engines and cabooses, and this change lets me use them. And maybe the real reason for the change is simple. I did it because after 15 years of timetable and train order, I was ready for a change. So I had the time and the inspiration. Deciding what to do and what changes my layout needed wasn't hard. I'd thought about it enough that the work just came down to execution. Only one area needed new modeling and a bit of track revision. Most other places, it was just a matter of changing signs on the layout. Notice the picture in the upper right. That's Willbridge Yard in modern times. It's on what would now be the running track on my switching layout. Even though it's only a few miles from downtown Portland and is in an industrial area, you can see Oregon still has plenty of trees and open space, not at all like the more crowded Midwest and Northeastern industrial areas. Below is a picture on my layout. The two scenes are not so different. That's why I didn't have to rebuild scenes to make the new layout believable. I suppose radios could have been in use in 1957, but I've never been a fan of family series radios, so I'm continuing to use the PBX phone system I installed several years ago. It's not sophisticated, but it works. One of the keys to making a layout a switching railroad is that what would be the main line of most layouts is now a running track. It's only used for switching operations. No scheduled trains and no extras that are not working in local industries ever occupy the running track. Here's the area I'm now modeling. It's a 10-mile stretch of industrial Portland between the Willamette and Columbia rivers. The only area that required much modeling was Kenton, where the old logging scene was. Hoyt Street and Swift didn't even need a name change. Incidentally, I am talking about Vancouver, Washington. Vancouver, British Columbia is about 300 miles north. All of these areas are connected by a running track instead of a main line. I wanted different railroads to operate the different yards, and you can see here how I've color-coded locations to show which railroads work which areas. Hoyt Street is the Oregon Coast Yard. The Swift job and the Kenton local operate out of the Hoyt Street Yard. Willbridge is the SP&S yard. The North Portland local operates out of Willbridge, and the Northern Pacific yard is in Vancouver. The operating scheme is pretty simple. Each railroad runs yard transfers to the other two railroads. That's the only way cars get moved from one railroad to another. When a transfer is made up, the yard asks the dispatcher for the authority to use a running track, and someone from the yard crew runs the transfer. While one yard crew member is running the transfer, the remaining yard crew can work the industries in their area and build or break down other yard transfers and locals. All movement on the running track is at reduced speed. The Swift job, Kenton local and North Portland local, can use a running track in their working area, but need authority to go to and from their yards. You can see the work which each yard handles. The allowable length of yard transfers is set by the length of their arrival and departure tracks. Maximum length of the train is 18 cars, so a Hoyt Street or Vancouver yard transfer could have cars for both of the other yards as long as the total length of their train doesn't exceed 18 cars and the number of cars for the other yards doesn't exceed that yard's limits. That doesn't work for Willbridge Yard since it's between the other two. This is the eastern end of the Hoyt Street Yard and the eastern end of the Oregon Coast Railroad. Rather than staging, these are interchange tracks. The story is that before the session starts, the SP, UP, and SP&S have run yard transfers from their locations in Portland and set out cars on the Hoyt Street interchange tracks. Hoyt Street Yard then uses these cars to build yard transfers or locals and set outs for industries near the yard. As the interchange tracks are cleared, the Hoyt Street crew can then put outbound cars for SP, UP, and SP&S yards on those tracks. Some magic time after session, the OCRR runs these transfers. You can see on the bill boxes the number of cars each track can hold. The two empty tracks in the far right go to a hidden loop under that hill. During an app session, no trains come from there, so the yardmaster actually has 2 more interchange tracks if he needs them. Interchange tracks can hold more than 80 cars, and that's been plenty. The Hoyt Street yard is 32 feet long. This end, the yard end, has a classification yard that can hold 40 plus cars. That's enough because many of the inbound cars from yard transfers and locals are immediately switched out to one of the interchange tracks. The yardmaster normally operates from this position. On his left is the assistant yardmaster who runs the yard switcher and works the arrival and departure tracks. These tracks can hold 18 cars. The hostler works the far end, hostling engines and also running strings of cars back and forth between the arrival departure tracks and the interchange tracks. Sometime during the session, they can also switch to local industries. I explained Swift meatpacking plant operations in a previous YouTube, so just a few comments here. The Swift crew works for the Hoyt Street yardmaster. They work the plant and move cars back and forth between Swift and Hoyt Street. For those runs, they talk to the yardmaster, who, if he's ready for them, calls the dispatcher and gets permission for them to use the running track between Swift and Hoyt Street. Kenton is a local job that comes out of the Hoyt Street yard and returns there when done. The crew also talks to the yardmaster, who gets them permission to go out and then come back on a running track. The local can use the running track within the Kenton boundaries to do their work. Industries served include the Columbia River Salmon Cannery, an Armor Branch House, and several cold storage and food wholesalers, as well as an unloading ramp for a car dealer and a large team track area. If a yard transfer is coming through, there's usually a bit of negotiation to get that train by, but the Kenton local has enough working track to be out of the way most of the time or to easily move out of the way. North Portland is another local, this one out of the Spokane, Portland, Seattle's Willbridge yard. After the Shell Marine Pier, there's Victoria Windows and then a pull yard. Then, after a run of about 25 feet, train gets to an interchange track in the Bissinger Wool Pullery. The interchange track is served by an out-of-sight terminal railroad engine handling cars from a chemical plant and a couple of lumber industries. The last 3 industries are Condensatory, which produces canned milk, the millworks, and the OCRR supply yard. Willbridge is the SP&S yard. This is the west end with the Oregon wheat growers. If the fascia weren't there, there would be a pier for loading wheat into Asia-bound ships. Behind Oregon wheat, there's a hole in the wall so the running track can continue west to Vancouver. The other tall building is Western Wax Paper, which was a real company. Willbridge has a small yard and an oil loading facility. You can also see over the trees an engine that will bring in the Astoria local. The crew working Willbridge brings that train in and then runs the outbound Astoria local back where it started. This train is normally 6 to 8 cars. The Ilwaco float is unloaded and then loaded each session. The eastern end of Willbridge has an electrical supply warehouse and a terminal for ocean shipping. Vancouver's in the next room. Trains come out of a hole in the wall just to the left and behind Tillamook Cheese. Vancouver is much more about switching industries than working a yard. After Tillamook Cheese, there's a large lumber mill, and then on the other side of the aisle is Bell Oil. Behind Bell, you can see a working track and then a track serving the lumber pier. Still in Vancouver, this is the area the yardmaster normally works. He handles the terminal and directs the 2 assistant yardmasters to break down or build transfers that will use the 2 arrival and departure tracks. To the yardmaster's right, you will start to see Christopher Paper. Hidden back there is the track that runs under the plant. We're now at the end of the line, the yard in Vancouver. Switchers come and go from the hole running under the plant. The trains here would be going north to Seattle or east towards Spokane or coming from those directions. Many of the cars here are just going to Vancouver Industries, and many cars in Vancouver just return to the Vancouver yard for onward movement. Others will go on to yard transfers to Willbridge and Hoyt Street. Crews talk to their yard masters, and then the yard master talks to the dispatcher by telephone. One reason is because the yard master should be able to tell crews working for him what he wants them to do or not do. For instance, should they come back to the yard or they need to hold out until told different. Another reason is that without this rule, it's easy for the session to slide into Mother May I mode. That is, the yard transfer has arrived at the yard and now it's ready to return light. In my train room, it's too easy to just turn to the dispatcher and ask if you can go. Returning from yard transfers caboose light is a union rule from the period. It also means every yard transfer is 2 trains, one with the cars for the receiving yard and a caboose light return to a home yard. I use car cards to show the movement of cars. Placards are on the fascia all around the layout. The placards show the abbreviations for locations on the layout. If reefer 70269 is at Kenton, it will be moved to the Hoyt Street Yard, HST. If it's already at Hoyt Street, or when it gets to Hoyt Street, the yard crew will then put it on an interchange track to ALB, the Union Pacific's Albina Yard in Portland. If flat car 3603 isn't at any of the places on the route, it goes to the Hoyt Street Yard, the first destination on its route. At Hoyt Street, it will be put on a yard transfer to Willbridge. At Willbridge, it will go on a local to Astoria. Any car may be moved to some of the locations on its route, or all of the locations, or maybe not moved at all if a crew doesn't get to it during the session. Regardless of how much or how little the car is moved, waybills are not turned during the session. I do need a dispatcher. Sometimes I do it myself because it's not that complicated. This is Herb Beagle dispatching when the layout was still Timetable Train Order. You can tell by the paperwork he has in front of him that it is a Timetable and Train Order session. He also has dispatched a new configuration several times and helped me figure out how to make it work. The biggest paperwork job in the transition from Timetable and Train Order was revising the car cards. In addition, the addition of Kenton and its industries is one reason, and then just renaming several locations meant almost every car needed revision. That's about 350. I pretty much have it now, but occasionally an out-of-date card still pops up and surprises me. You can see the list of documents I don't need for my switching layout. Not having them and not having to keep them up to date makes my model railroading life much easier. The running track on the layout is a single track, so the dispatcher's biggest job is making sure trains meet at the single long passing siding, which is in North Portland. Either that or trains are held in the yards until the running track is clear. The passing track in North Portland can easily handle an 18-car train, but if the North Portland local is working the area, it occupies one or the other of the double-ended sidings, so then only the running track is available for through traffic. The dispatcher also checks with the receiving yard masters before allowing a yard transfer to head towards them to make sure their yard has room for the train. Hoyt Street has enough tracks to handle 2 or 3 inbound or outbound trains at a time, but Willbridge and Vancouver can only deal with 1 inbound or outbound at a time. The big challenge I have found in switching operations is to keep it prototypical. As long as the dispatcher and the yard master use the telephone and the crews talk to their yard masters, things run correctly. If they just start talking across the room or not getting permission to use a running track even for a short distance, the safe movement of cars, which is a key to prototype operations, gets lost. I suspect this problem will pretty much cure itself as time goes by and we all get used to how to operate in the switching environment. A small problem is a few structures are orphans, like the passenger station in this picture. It doesn't make much sense on a running track. Tillamook cheese is now in Vancouver. Every Oregonian knows it's in Tillamook. I guess that problem is solvable if it ever bothers me enough. I really enjoy the flexibility of a switching layout. Virtually any size crew is good, and we can do as many or as few of the jobs as we want and start and stop wherever we choose. To stage the layout, all I have to do is flip car cards and make sure open load cars are in the right starting locations. As you can see, my friend Cam Green seems to be having a good time, and that's the goal, so I'm pleased with the new operating scheme. I marked the first item in red because the one thing I'm certain I will do in the future is make changes to the structures, industries, and scenery on the layout. I don't know what and when, but change is what makes the hobby and the layout interesting for me, so I know it'll happen. The timetable and train order of good dispatcher was critical. Now I find a knowledgeable yard master at Hoyt Street and another one in Vancouver really improve the pace of operations because they can guide their assistant yard masters. It's not critical, but yard masters who know the layout and the work make sessions more fun for all of us. Here you can see the details of a typical op session. That's it. If you have questions, ideas, or comments we didn't get to, you're welcome to send me an email. Thanks for watching.